Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is to welcome back Yuval Levin as our guest on Conversing today. Some of you may remember his first time on our program when we were discussing a recent book that he had written called America's Covenant regarding the Constitution. And he wrote that book during his time serving, as he continues to do, as the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He was the founder and editor of National Affairs, and he's also the senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor to the National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Yuval, welcome back to Conversing. Thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thanks very much for having me.
More than you know, I have a continuous conversation going on in my head with you. And it's with you, not about you. It's just with you in an imaginary sense, because I feel like when you first came on to Conversing, you had just published the book America's Covenant, which is a book on the Constitution and your own presentation of what you think the center of the constitutional argument is for how American governance is meant to be focused. But for those who didn't hear that first episode, I wonder if you could just recap the book, because we're going to jump off from that into a number of questions.
Sure, thank you. The essence of the book is really a reintroduction to the Constitution through the lens of the challenge of national cohesion, national unity in a diverse society. The book argues that the authors of the Constitution had very much in mind the challenge of unity and cohesion to a greater degree than we imagine now, that it's not a coincidence that the first goal that's laid out in the preamble to the Constitution is to form a more perfect union, that the writings of the framers of the document really focused on the challenges of faction, the challenges of division, and that the system they created is built around a deep recognition of the fact that our society is always going to be divided, so that broad agreement is not really likely on any significant issue. And therefore, we need ways, if we're going to be a unified society, to act on an understanding of unity that is rooted in a kind of classical political understanding that says unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the question for a modern political society is, how do we act together when we don't think alike? The American Constitution is a set of answers to that question. And at the core of those answers is the necessity for accommodation, for bargaining, for competition, for negotiation, For that reason, the central institution in our system is the United States Congress. We incline to think of the presidency as central, but the presidency is the second branch for a reason. The first branch is the legislature, and what happens in the legislature is that the diversity of society is represented in the diversity of the membership, and then those members negotiate on behalf of their constituencies and find ways to address public problems that are broadly acceptable in a way that values legitimacy over efficiency, that says what we really need are to make sure that we have majorities as broad as we reasonably can get them, and that government acts in ways that are broadly deemed legitimate. A lot of what we find mysterious and frustrating about the American system of government is a function of the way that it prioritizes this, because it's often inefficient. Even compared to other democracies, the American system doesn't empower narrow majorities. It doesn't say, well, you won 50% plus one vote, so you have all the power until the next election. That is not how our system works. It says you won narrowly, so go and work with those people and broaden your majority. And there's no avoiding finding that frustrating in a time when narrow majorities are all we have. We live in such a time, and so we are frustrated. But it's really important to see that the alternative to the system we have is not some kind of much more efficient parliamentary system. The alternative is a breakdown of social order. This system allows us to address our problems through bargaining and negotiation, provided that we allow it to work. And we're living in a time when we're not allowing it to work. We emphasize the presidency and the courts. We put Congress third rather than first. And a lot has broken down in our system as a result. The argument of the book is if we're going to recover, we need to restore an understanding of the original logic of the system, which is very much a logic oriented by the need for social cohesion in a diverse society.
I just think the way you've captured that is so extremely compelling to me and does give great explanation both for the problem that we face as well as for the potential solution, not because it would necessarily simplify all the problems, but because it would give it a structure, a form, an expression for how to handle that kind of pluralism and difference. So I'm curious, what did you learn from the book's acceptance after it was out? You wrote the book at a time, I should say, that where the problems that we're seeing right now were already evident, but they have, I think you would agree, only become more dramatically evident. So I'm just curious, how has this argument been received?
You know, the peculiar thing for me, so this book came out in June of 2024, June of last year, which means that it was a book whose reception has spanned an election season. And what I found was that before the last election, there was great receptivity on the right to the argument that presidential power was excessive, that we needed to restore some balance against it. There was a sense that what the court was doing was important to restrain the executive, but also that Congress needed to reawaken itself. And by now, a year plus later, there's pretty wide acceptance of that on the left, and much less acceptance of that on the right. And in a sense, of course, that's not shocking. Where you stand depends on where you sit very often in American politics. And, you know, when your party is out of power, you suddenly love federalism and you love the courts and restraints on majorities. And when your party's in power, you think democracy, democracy, democracy. But I do think that the core argument, which is that Congress matters most, is more important now than I quite understood at the time that I was writing the book. And I think it's actually not apparent enough even to opponents of the current administration. We're watching a lot of titanic struggles between the president and the courts.
Yes.
And it's hard to draw people's attention to the dog that isn't barking, which I think is actually the problem in the American system. It's not that presidents are too assertive. That would not have surprised the framers of the Constitution at all. And it's not that courts are too aggressive. They expected that. It's that Congress is underactive, radically underactive.
Right.
And has turned itself into a spectator. That's the biggest problem we have. And in the absence of doing something about that problem, I don't think there is a way out of a path that leads to greater and greater presidential autocracy, regardless of party, and it's not about one person. It's not even a matter of ideology. It's a structural reality of a system like ours that is meant to be held in balance by conflict and contention, that if Congress isn't in the fight, the president will grow too strong.
Right. Would you say has grown too strong?
Yes, has grown too strong. And I don't attribute that simply to Donald Trump, though certainly he's pushed further than our other modern presidents have. But our presidents have grown too strong. We look to them to do things that are fundamentally legislative, to drive an ideological agenda that was put before voters in the last election and turn it into public programs. That is Congress's job description. And when we look to our presidents to do that, it means that it's not done by bargaining and negotiation. It's done by sheer acts of will, and that is not good for our society.
Yuval, do you consider yourself an originalist?
I do. I'm an originalist, but I would stress that originalism is a philosophy of judicial interpretation. It's not a whole approach to the Constitution. It's an approach to the proper role of the judge. And I think the role of the judge is to apply the law and the Constitution. That requires interpretation. The law is sometimes vague and situations are very unclear. And in those moments, the place to look to understand the meaning of the law is the text of the law. That's originalism. I would not think of that as saying that only the original words of the Constitution matter to us as citizens. But if I were a judge, I would certainly try to do my everyday work in accordance with originalism.
Right. So is it not right that one of the things that has been said about the majority of the Supreme Court is that they tend toward being originalists themselves, and yet they are the ones who, it would seem to at least a non-constitutional expert like me, that many of their findings have gone in the direction opposite to what you're saying, namely just giving more and more power to the executive branch and not restraining that power themselves, or it seems pointing toward Congress. Now, if I'm not sorting that correctly, by all means, tell me so.
I don't agree with that, I guess. I think that the current court, well, first of all, I would say of the three branches, the court is certainly the closest to doing its job properly. That's a low bar at the moment, but it is important. I would also argue that for the most part, the court is operating under originalist principles. And the reason why it isn't sufficient as a restraint on presidential power is that our presidents are able to overact because Congress is underactive, which means that it's not the courts that can step in and balance them out, but Congress. Now, the court is pressing Congress constantly to do that. I would say that a good summary of the last 15 years of administrative law decisions in the Supreme Court would just be, Congress, do your job. And the trouble is the court can't force Congress to do its job. It can only sort of stand on the side and wish that it did. Nobody can force Congress to do its job. One of the things it means that Congress is the most powerful branch of our government structurally is that effectively Congress has no duties. It has only powers. That's not true of the president. That's not true of the courts. There are certain things they have to do. The court has to take cases. They have some leeway, the Supreme Court does, over which they accept, but there are certain original jurisdiction cases. When they come up, they have to take them. The lower courts have to take every case that's filed. The president, there are certain things he has to do, and those are prescribed by law and by the Constitution. Congress has powers, which means Congress has options. And if Congress chooses to do nothing, it is allowed to do nothing. And there's only so much the court can do about that. Now, I do think that in particular cases, I could certainly point to areas where the Supreme Court has taken a kind of maximalist view of presidential power over the executive branch. But I actually think that is within the framework of originalism. This court ascribes to what sometimes is called a unitary executive theory. Unitary executive is not a theory about American government. It's a theory about executive power. So in other words, it begins from the first sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution, which says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, period. That means that all executive power belongs to the president personally, and everyone else who exercises executive power is doing it in a way that is delegated by the president. So cabinet secretaries, various regulatory agencies, all of them are acting at the president's behest, and ultimately the president decides. The president can hire and fire them. The president can tell them what to do. There's no one else who they are accountable to. And so I would summarize the challenges we're looking at now in the big struggles between the courts and the president with a very straightforward kind of rule of thumb that says the president is in charge of the executive branch, but the executive branch is not in charge of the American government. And if the court is facing a case where the question is the president in charge of the executive branch? Things like, can he fire this person? If he appointed this person, he can probably fire this person. Does he have the authority to have this agency share data with that agency? Yes, they both work for him. He does. If the question is, can he ignore the law? Can he refuse to spend money that Congress appropriated? Then I think the answer will be no. And there will be some marginal cases, the tariff cases, for example, where I think the court is likely to lean against executive power and to say the president has to do what he is told and Congress is in charge here. But many of the cases we've seen, the kind of big ticket cases we've seen about immigration enforcement, about the powers of the president to fire people, those really are cases about whether the president is in charge of the executive branch. And there is a competing theory that's more popular among progressives that says that administrative agencies are independent. And their independence is a source of their authority, and the president can't just fire people. Now, I would point out to them that this particular wave of unitary executive rulings began in the Biden years, when President Biden fired the commissioner of the Social Security Administration, who had been appointed by Donald Trump, and declined to resign, which is the norm for a new president. You normally, political appointees leave office. The Social Security Commissioner was appointed to the normal 5-year term and stayed on, and Joe Biden fired him. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, I think rightly, that yes, the president has the authority to fire this person. That's the power that Donald Trump is using in trying to fire, say, a member of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, the court's going to have to decide, is it the same thing? Maybe the Federal Reserve Board is different. I think there's an argument to be made there. But broadly speaking, people who exercise executive power really do work for the president, but there are limits to executive power.
Again, I'm thinking of this both just for myself as an ordinary citizen who's not a constitutional expert. As I read the papers, follow the news pretty closely, what strikes me, going back to what feels like the enlargement of executive power, if I'm understanding what you're saying, and this is what I want to double check, you're saying that there is a consistency to the argument of executive power under this unitary government, unitary executive sort of approach, and that what the court has done is simply to uphold that. And because Donald Trump is somebody who seems to have no boundaries in self-regulation about that, is going to take it as far as it can possibly go.
I think this is what's going on. And it's understandable that there are people saying, well, but look at the big picture. Look at what's going on here. It's not just about this one case. He's doing this everywhere, and that's got to matter for this case. That's not a crazy view. I think that's a reasonable way to think about our situation, but not for a judge.
Right.
The role of a judge really is limited, and the question in front of the court really is the particular case in front of the court. I think we have this attitude about judges. People think of judges as kind of playing the role of King Solomon and just seeing to it that the outcome is just and wise. That would be great, but that's not, and I think with good reason, it is not the role of the judge in a free society. The role of the judge in a free society is to see to it that the law is obeyed. And the judges are only asked whether what's in front of them is a violation of the law or the Constitution or not. Saying that it is not may permit an unjust outcome and an unwise outcome. That's happening all the time, and it happens all the time. But their job is not to assure a wise outcome. Their job is to assure that the law is obeyed. And that's part of why it's hard to be a judge. I think you have to be willing to allow for a lot of outcomes you don't approve of, because that's what the law is. And in a democracy, the law is made by the people's representatives, not by judges.
So if Congress is meant to be the center and is now in third place, or in first position, as you put it, rather than in third position, the other thing that's also obviously being discussed daily is the state of the court itself and the court system. So there's things to be said, and I'll come to this in a minute, about the Supreme Court itself. But what was interesting to me are two angles from outside the court that I wanted to have you respond to. One is the rather substantial group of judges who have written this letter to the Supreme Court saying, you are overreaching and you are controlling things that are then partisan. They're just naming it. It feels partisan. It does not feel like it's upholding the law. It feels like it's just your own political agenda now being subverted under the presidential will to do things that the other courts, lower courts, have sought to do in their own particular way. Some of these judges are certainly progressive. Others are not as progressive. They're more, I'll call them mainstream rather than necessarily progressive. How do you understand and hear that complaint?
I think they're speaking for a generally mainstream view of what the judge's role is that is contested and that I personally think is mistaken. And so they object to the outcomes, the substantive outcomes of these cases. And again, they make the argument that in the big picture, you have to recognize this isn't just a normal moment. And there's a role for the courts in addressing the general character of the American regime right now. I think the trouble with that is that you could always make that argument, and that it is an argument for judicial will being exercised without restraint. Judges are dangerous in a free society because they're unaccountable. They have their jobs for life. They don't have to get elected or reelected. That's good, so that they're not constantly answerable to momentary majorities. But it also means that they're not accountable. And so they have to restrain themselves. And originalism is ultimately a mode of self-restraint for judges. That's not all it is, but it is, I think, fundamentally a way of trying to ground judicial decisions in some objective standard. And the standard is, what does the law say?
Right.
You can disagree about their interpretation of how the law applies in a particular situation, but to say that they should instead consider the overall political situation, that seems to me a cure worse than the disease. And I don't think it's where we want to end up. It would involve a politicization of the courts that would make them very hard to trust. Everything else is already so politicized in our society right now that I think we have to try to minimize the politicization of the courts. It's never going to be zero, but it should be kept as modest as it can be. And I think on the whole, the courts are handling this moment reasonably well. The Supreme Court is handling this moment reasonably well. Never perfectly, but reasonably well. Now, so far, we haven't seen a moment where the president just simply ignores the court and does what he is told not to do by the court. That would be a different kind of crisis than we now confront. And it's imaginable. It's perfectly imaginable. You can imagine it in particular on the tariff case that is coming before the court soon in November, because tariffs really matter to this president. And if they tell him, as I think they will, that the way he's done this is illegal, I don't know what he will do. But so far, the court has been able to assert its authority. And I think for that to continue and to be done in a legitimate way, they have to stick to the law, even when the outcome might not be what they or we would like.
So would you say then to these judges who have objected to the conduct of the Supreme Court, I think you're making the case that the Supreme Court is operating within appropriate boundaries, that it's not guilty of overreach or partisanship. Maybe that's not the word you would use. Is it guilty of partisanship? It seems to many people it's highly guilty of partisanship.
Well, I think that depends on whether you think that their approach to interpreting the Constitution is partisan. That is originalism partisan? If so, then they are originalists. And if that is a party, they are members of that party. But I think that that's an argument about how to interpret the Constitution and not about what public policy should achieve. And therefore, it's not partisan in the way in which we normally mean that. Our judges, because they're appointed by Republicans and Democrats, do tend to represent the approaches to the Constitution of the left and right. And yeah, I think if you look at the current Supreme Court, most of the 9 justices are pretty predictable. You look at a case and you think, well, I can tell you how Justice Barrett's going to vote on this. The reason for that is not that she's a Republican. The reason for that is that she has a particular approach to the Constitution that we know and can apply. And I think that's true of Justice Jackson, too. So I don't think of the court at this moment as partisan in that way. Now, I will say, the court is being drawn into modes of action that are not traditionally judicial. And that is the fault of the president. What I mean by that is there's an enormous amount of administrative action now, and it requires quick responses from the court because it creates situations where real human beings are stuck in a place where they believe their rights are being violated. They're going to court as a result. And you can't wait 6 months to resolve the case. They're going to be, they're going to be deported, or they're going to be stripped of their rights by then.
Right.
Normally, the courts take time. And more generally than that, the judiciary acts in the past tense. Only the president acts in the present tense. You can think about our three branches in this way. Congress acts in the future tense. It frames laws that will apply tomorrow.
Yes.
The courts act in the past tense. They review actions that happened yesterday, and they decide if they were appropriate or not. The president acts in the present tense. He gets the 3 a.m. phone call, and he's got to decide now what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what is now confronting the Supreme Court is a demand for the court to act in the present tense. And it is very, very difficult for a judicial institution to do that well.
Right.
So they are certainly being dragged into things that are not traditionally judicial. They have all these emergency docket decisions. There's no time to write a decision. So they reach a conclusion without explaining it, which makes life very difficult for lower court judges.
Right.
All of that is a problem.
Right.
But I think they're trying to deal with that problem within the bounds of the judicial role.
Right. So that's a response in the last few minutes to the question of whether these judges who have been speaking to and against the Supreme Court and its approach to various things is under question by them. Let's take a second group. The second group is a group of people who are both mainstream and in this case not progressive, but more conservative. And they come out of a conservatism that is now questioning the viability and sustainability of the Constitution and are feeling as though there's really reasons to think that perhaps the Constitution should either be significantly revised or even abandoned, at least some of the extreme language has suggested that, in order to come back to some kind of new approach to how governance should work in the United States. Comment on that, if you would, please.
Yeah, that is a growing voice on the right. It's a minority voice, but I think a significant one. And it seems to me that it also is represented somewhat in the president's circle. I don't know if that's Donald Trump's view. I think it's very hard to say, and I don't think he really has a view of the Constitution in that way. But some of the people who are driving decision-making in the administration, I think, for example, of the team at the Office of Management and Budget, which is driving a lot of the strategy of the administration's relationship with Congress around the budget, has expressed the view that the traditional structure of the American constitutional system has already been broken. They believe it was broken by the progressives, and that therefore there is a need now for a much more assertive president than was conceived of in our Constitution, that the only way to advance any ideal of the good in our society now is through a very strong president asserting his will over the system. And a lot of what they're doing involves trying to force fights that will allow our system to lean more heavily in the direction of presidential power. So they want the president to impound funds, not spend money that Congress appropriated, so that that question goes to the court, and the court, they believe, will say that the president can do that and has all the power of the purse that we've traditionally thought belongs to Congress. They want to assert his power over law enforcement in a more extreme way, over the border, over economic policy. I am very concerned about this kind of Caesarism. I think it is very dangerous. It is, first of all, it's a danger to the freedom of the American people in a very traditional sense, in a way that the framers of the Constitution understood very well. You don't want the executive to be too powerful. You don't want them to be too weak either, but that's not the problem we have right now. Secondly, I think it is also ultimately a foolish way to think, because the basic insight that the Madisonian Constitution tries to hammer home for us is that all of us will find ourselves in the minority sooner or later. And in a sense, every power that you assign to any institution in our system, the question to ask yourself is not, how could I use this power, but what will happen when people I don't agree with have this power?
Right.
And I think the people around the president now are failing to ask that question, even though there was a president of the other party just a year ago, and there may well be another one in 3.5 years. there seems to be this bizarre assumption of a kind of permanency of right-wing power, and they think the way to make something of it is to maximize the power of the presidency because Congress is too slow or majorities are too narrow and it can't get anything done. So let's get it done this way. The American system is built to force a different response to this, the frustration they feel. It is built to say, I can't get anything done this way, so I've got to work with other people. I've got to broaden the majority. What do I need to give them so that I can get what I want? And the resistance to that way of thinking is driving a kind of emphasis on presidential power, which I think is profoundly misguided. I don't think they will succeed in court, so to the extent that they need that, that probably won't happen. I don't think they will get an impoundment power. I think they probably won't win the tariff case, and so they'll get a lot of resistance. The trouble is, as we said at the outset, the only ultimately effective resistance would have to come from Congress. And my worry at this point, people often ask, are we in a constitutional crisis? And I think that it's a very hard term to define, but I would offer this definition. I think of constitutional contention in terms of 3 C's. On the one end is what I would call constitutional creep, which is change in the balance of power that it goes unresisted and just happens.
Yes.
On the other end, the other extreme, is constitutional crisis, where there is a tension that can't be resolved by normal means. And so the court says no, the president does yes. What's supposed to happen now? It seems like only some use of force can resolve this question. That's a crisis. In the middle, I think of this in the mode of a kind of Aristotelian virtue, right? There's 2 vices on either end. In the middle is constitutional conflict, which is a virtue in our system. Right. That's supposed to happen. So that when the president pushes, Congress is supposed to push back. And then they end up somewhere in the middle so that the problem can get resolved, but the balance of power is retained. I think right now we're not witnessing a constitutional crisis where the president pushes very hard, one of the other branches pushes back, and there's violence in the streets. It's not at all unimaginable, but it's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is constitutional creep, where the president is pushing and nobody's pushing back. Mm-hmm. And only Congress can do it. So in order to reestablish some kind of virtuous constitutional conflict, Congress has to recognize that its powers are being taken away and stand up for those. I don't see that happening short of some divided government. I think Republicans in Congress, while Donald Trump is president, seem unwilling and unable to rise to the defense of their own institution. That, to me, is the biggest problem we face. I worry a lot about Donald Trump, but the reason I worry is that Congress is not doing its job.
Right. So zeroing in on that as our next category, I'm moved by what you're saying about the nature of the crisis, and certainly it is, I guess I would see it as at least constitutional creep and maybe some of the other things as well. But I get your point about the creep. And if Congress is the response to the creep, then we're really in an even more troubled place, because for all the reasons we've discussed, Congress isn't really doing its job, at least in my assessment. And its job isn't meant to necessarily establish something that the president has to submit to per se, as much as it is that they are meant to contend for the larger debates and concerns in all of their pluralism.
That's very important to see, Mark, the balance of our system is not held up like the beams of a roof where they lean on each other. The balance is sustained dynamically. It's held together by the fact that everybody's pushing all the time in opposite directions. So the failure to push, it's a strange kind of problem, but we don't have enough conflict in our constitutional system right now. Even though it feels like we're at each other's throats, we're not. We're not doing enough to sustain the balance of power.
Right. Do you see that changing, barring a change of balance in the makeup of the Congress at the midterms? Do you see that changing, and what would it take for Congress to become more actively engaged?
I think it's very hard to see it under these conditions. That is, a Republican Congress with a very narrow majority and a Republican president, particularly Donald Trump. Now, we're not going to have that situation forever. And so I think in the medium term, I do see it changing. I think, in fact, that there's a pattern in American history of presidents who are able to get away with this kind of thing for a while, and then periods of congressional reassertion. You see it after Woodrow Wilson. You see it after Franklin Roosevelt, who really pushed the boundaries of the system. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt made himself president for life, effectively. He did it by getting elected and reelected, but he did. He broke that norm.
Right.
And there was, after him, a period of response. There was a constitutional amendment to make sure that nobody could run for 4 terms. There was a lot of congressional action to create an infrastructure for oversight. The Administrative Procedures Act that really restrains what administrative agencies can do. All these things that we just think of as always existing.
Yes.
They didn't always exist. They're from the late 1940s, after FDR died.
Right.
There was a similar period after Richard Nixon where you see the Budget Act of 74, the War Powers Act, all kinds of ways of Congress trying to reassert itself against the president.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's entirely imaginable that there will be a period like that after this presidency. The trouble is it's harder to imagine it during this presidency.
Yes. Right. It's the absence of oxygen.
Yeah.
On lots of different fronts. I'm curious, if you were to describe at this stage your understanding of Donald Trump's power compared to his first term, how would you describe it? Obviously, many have commented that it's more expansive, it's more aggressive, but you have a sharp observation of this. So how would you describe it?
I would say that he this time is surrounded by people who think that what went wrong in the first term was that he was too restrained.
Mm-hmm.
That is also his own view. Now, I think it was his view the first time, but everybody around him the first time thought, this is only going to go well if we restrain him. And so there were cabinet officials, White House officials at every level.
Military officials.
Yeah, and military officials who said no, and even in some extreme cases who just didn't carry out a presidential order. Now, there's a problem with that. That's not a good thing, and that kind of insubordination at the highest levels is dangerous. But I do think that it created a set of restraints on him. This time around, we very rarely, only once before, had a president who serves a full term, then has 4 years to kind of sit and stew and think about it, and then come back. And I think that any one-term president, if he were allowed to do that, would come back with something like this conclusion, which is, I just need to be allowed to be me. That's what went wrong last time. Okay. But everybody in Trump's circle now has that view. And so the restraints are not there. And there's just a lot that is being advanced that much of which I think won't be practical, won't really work. But it is throwing around presidential power in ways that are unsettling a lot of settled practices and systems. And look, some of them have needed disruption, but they also need replacement. I would say a lot of what's going on is just a widespread loss of trust in the American government as a partner around the world and in American life, in universities, in the world of scientific research, in corporations, the sense that the American government is basically pretty steady. And, we can try to make changes, but ultimately it's going to keep its promises, is no longer the reigning view.
Right.
I think it's going to be very, very hard to recover that view. And obviously, there's some good in this. Our allies did need to invest more in their own security. There has been a need for more responsible behavior by American universities. But we should see that we've also benefited enormously from the fact that so many people around the world and around the country were able to count on the American government as a partner. It's been this kind of invisible subsidy for American life in so many ways. And I think it has been undermined and will not return. And it's not just about Donald Trump in the future, because what everybody has seen is that from now on, any president at will can alter all of these relationships. Every university president in America has looked at his budget and realized, wow, I am really dependent on the president being reliable. I just cannot do this anymore. And they're not going to do it anymore. And so I think there's the kinds of benefits that we've gotten from that invisible subsidy aren't coming back. Some of the disruption will serve us well. There will be room after this to build some new systems, but it is tremendous disruption, and it does come at a very great cost.
I was in a conversation not long ago where someone who's a progressive activist was really making the appeal to a group of people about feeling that what has happened is that we've crossed many red lines since January, and the appeal and the concern that he had is that so many people, I'm here thinking particularly of the voices that might belong under the category of Martin Luther King's, moderate pastors, who just didn't seem to see the crisis and said, no, it's really not as bad. And obviously King was saying, no, you've definitely crossed a red line. This friend of mine was saying, we've definitely crossed red lines, multiple red lines. If we've crossed red lines, what would you point to?
Yeah. Well, I think the question that I would put to such an argument is, what does this mean we should be doing?
Mm-hmm.
I do think that a lot of longstanding norms of American political practice have been broken here.
Mm-hmm.
Those norms did not exist forever. They didn't come down from Mount Sinai. They came from somewhere, but they've existed for a long time. At least the kind of post-World War II American political order had a certain character to it. And that character is certainly being broken now. I think the question is, where does that leave us as political actors, as citizens or as policymakers in this system? What should we be doing about this? The president was elected. He is certainly pushing the boundaries of presidential power, but in ways that are questionable in most respects. He can make an argument for himself and is trying to do that. I'm very worried about where this leaves some vulnerable people in our society. I think our treatment of immigrants now in the United States is unconscionable. But most Americans don't agree with that. And if you put it up for a vote, I think it's probably the single most popular thing that Donald Trump is doing. I also think he's doing some damage to our economy, but we'll see. That may be right or it may be wrong. And so to simply say, all the norms are being thrown away, I think you'd have to make an argument about what this demands of us now and what it would look like to respond to it in an effective way.
Right.
This is not the lowest moment in the history of the American regime by any stretch. We have seen presidents who have pushed harder than this and reached further than this. I think a lot of things that Wilson and even FDR did exceeded this idea of executive power. We've obviously seen much more division in the 19th century in America. But what does that mean? That doesn't mean they weren't wrong, and it doesn't mean this isn't wrong. To say we've survived worse is not to say this isn't very bad. I think it just constantly returns us to the question of what are we supposed to do about it? And to me, therefore, it is that debility of the rest of the system that worries me.
Right.
It is the fact that our other elected officials are not expressing their own views here. 80% of Congress disagrees with the president about tariffs. Well, then why is it happening? I think that's where the problem we confront really raises its head. Now, it could get worse than that, and I think we have to preserve the language of constitutional crisis because we may need that language.
Right.
And so I'm not inclined to throw it around now.
Right.
But that's not because I'm not worried.
Right. I do think that one of the reasons for a lot of fury from the center and the more progressive side is this feeling that the whole system has gotten locked up around one person and one person's personality drive. Yes. and it seems megalomania. And as a consequence, it feels like you can't actually have the full-on argument. Like, for example, you can see the things that he's doing regarding the dismantling of things like the DEI initiatives that have gone on. But it doesn't grapple with the question that we have a very unjust society in which people of diverse backgrounds are still raising the question, how do I find my life and my identity in this place, which seemed on the one hand to be welcoming to that. And now on the other hand, the logic of it seems to be, let's just shut down being a diverse nation. That's an impossibility. Right. And therefore, I think it stokes the fury of being hogtied every direction.
Yeah, and I think the sense in general that there's no room for any answer except yes or no in our system now.
Right.
All of our politics is just a yes or no question about Donald Trump and whatever he happens to be doing that day.
Yes.
This is very abnormal. I mean, you have to say, I worked for a Republican president. I worked for George W. Bush, a fairly conservative Republican president. He was constantly under criticism from the right in his own party and from the left in his own party, too, for various things he was doing. He appointed someone to the Supreme Court that the party didn't like, and they raised hell, and he pulled back.
Right.
Donald Trump has appointed lots of people to cabinet offices that the party has not liked. There are not 5 people in the Senate who think that RFK Jr. should be the Secretary of HHS, really. But none of them feel like they can say no. And to me, that's the most peculiar thing about this very, very peculiar time in our politics, is this way in which other politicians who, after all, have their own pride, have their own views, have their own constituencies too, feel like they are somehow indebted to him, even in cases where they won more of a majority in their state or district than he did. And they just can't say no. This is another way of stating the same problem, which is the reaction of the system around Trump is in many respects a bigger problem than Trump's own actions. And obviously these are connected, but to my mind, that's where the real worry is focused.
And do you think that flaw that you're describing, that collapse really, feels like it emerges out of characterological things, or is it about simply maintaining their own particular power, or their hope that somehow they can endure this and there will be a break that will eventually come?
Yeah, I think there's all of that in this. I mean, there is a sense that the culture they're operating in is his and not theirs. Mm-hmm. And they can't predict their own voters' reactions to things, but it just seems like getting on the wrong side of Trump is on the wrong side of these voters. There is also a lot of, 3 more years of this and then we're done with it. There's not another of this personality behind him, so we can get back to one thing or another. I don't know how much of that is true. But there is just a sense of a kind of willful weakness that, to me, is just very strange in the political world. This is a world that attracts willful people, and
right.
People with a big sense of themselves who kind of hear music when they look in the mirror. And where are they?
Well put. It's really, I think, certainly from my point of view, it's the first time in my own life where the experience of the national government has been as chaotic and as broken and as captured in a way as it obviously is right now. And that, I think it's helpful to always remember the historical examples that you've given, that this is not an unprecedented reality, but it is for many of, I'm a young boomer, and even though I'm not young, I can at least say that I'm a young boomer. And I'm struck by the extraordinary extent to which the tectonic plates of normalcy, whatever that was, good or bad, have shifted.
That's right. I think the period that the long phase that began in August of 1945 is only now ending, but it is now ending. It's not clear what will come after it, and I don't think Donald Trump will necessarily define what will come after it, but it is ending.
Right. So if we were to take the insights of America's Covenant and acknowledge all of these caveats of what is undoing the model that you were describing, I think, so powerfully in that book, what would your words of action be to the people who are listening to this? What would you encourage us to do? I mean, I find, just as before I allow you to speak, I'm just admitting that I'm a big writer to Congress, and I have almost stopped writing to Congress because it has felt so impenetrable and unchangeable. But what would you recommend?
I'd say don't stop, because they do. I mean, it does matter. Politics hasn't gone away, but certainly you shouldn't expect that writing to Congress will change policy in this moment. I think that the danger we confront is the danger of passivity. That's what happens when a republic loses its republican character. The politics of an autocratic state is a politics of spectators.
Right.
And we just cannot become spectators.
Right.
Part of what that means is trying to influence our policymakers in whatever way we can. It means exacting some price for our vote, actually wanting it to mean something, rather than just not the other party What
Right.
actually do you want this to be about?
Yes.
Part of it is also finding ways to become engaged yourself. Not everybody's going to be able to get involved in politics or should, but there are ways of addressing problems at the local level too, where things can work better, can be more
Right.
functional and healthier.
Right.
We're in a very strange moment in American life now where the state legislatures are more functional than Congress.
Yes.
That's odd,
Yes.
but
That's
make the
very
most
odd.
of it and
Right.
see what you can do there, because there is more that can move at that level, and most government happens at that level.
Right.
Not everything is about that one big yes or no question. And I
Right.
think we should try not to let ourselves fall into that view that this is all that matters, and so how can I affect this? A lot matters within your reach, and we should try to affect it.
Right. I had a law professor friend of mine once say that clear thinking is a moral act. And I want to just say as we finish how much I appreciate your clear thinking as a moral act, Yuval. And
I appreciate it, Mark.
I benefit continuously from your thoughts and reflections, and I felt today was just another example of that. So thank you very, very much for this time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.